There we go. So you should be seeing it. Does everyone see it?
Bingo.
Yep.
Looks great.
Awesome. So when I got asked to do a presentation for this meeting, it's been a couple of years since I did the last one, and I think I did the last one on use of social media monitoring for situational awareness and storm reporting and stuff like that. So I wanted to do something a little different that is really critical and also related to not only meteorologists, but also emergency management. So I'm actually in the Advanced Academy at EMI, and a part of being in the National Emergency Management Advanced Academy is doing a research paper. I'm really passionate about seeing where our level of weather education is for emergency management and how we can really improve that, since we make a lot of weather-related decisions. And so I actually chose this to be my research paper for the Advanced Academy, and I should be finishing this paper and submitting it in April. So I'm probably about 65% done. So that's why it's an introduction to present today. But I'm really excited with what maybe I can do after this paper. So please feel free to chime in, give feedback. If you have any good ideas, I would love to hear it. I'm really hoping to, like I said, do something with it, either with future research or working with AMS, NWA, or even IAEM to see if we can start some kind of weather training program. So key points today, very bland, kind of going through the format of my paper, taking a look at the purpose of the research I'm doing, the results and findings from doing a lot of different reading over lit reviews for weather and emergency management education, and then attempting to propose a future direction on how we can implement more weather-related training, and then also next steps in my research process. So the overall purpose, like I said, I think we're all very familiar with how many weather-related decisions we make in emergency management. According to Weaver et al., we actually have 78% of all emergencies that are weather-related. It is really, really important because of that, that we make sure that we educate our emergency managers and that they feel confident when they're receiving that weather briefing from NWS or from their professional meteorologist to make whatever decision that they need to make, or to also brief elected officials or do whatever they're trying to do with their weather information. So that's kind of the overall purpose. They also play a critical role in a lot of the alert and warning oversight with, like what we were talking about, tornado sirens, storm sirens, alert systems, coordination of processes and communication. So it's really important that we make sure that we understand just the basics of what weather is, how it works, and then understand the briefings and the fundamentals of forecasting. Kind of taking a look at where we are in the state of training in emergency management today. I think, once again, all of us know that we like to rant a lot on Twitter about lack of training frameworks. So around the country, there are not any requirements to take any training. It's very free will, depending on what state you're in, county, federal, whatever sector you're in. And usually it's based on availability. So, maybe somebody schedules one of those really cool classes on tornado awareness and you can drive to that class and take it. Or maybe your state brings it into their state association conference. So it's freely available for you to take it. Not all states have the same training access, which is something that EMI right now is trying to work on with their EMI Access Anywhere program that Dr. Stern is trying to roll out. But obviously that is a huge issue, talking about just training availability. Also, because we don't have any kind of framework, requirement, or even guide for what training we should be taking, some trainings get taken and some don't. Some people do take hurricane trainings and some people never actually see that, or they actually never learn that we even have those trainings available. And then lastly, too, I think it's also based on the value of training. So you'll see some local level emergency programs that are very passionate about providing training to their emergency managers. And then you'll see others that might not value training as much. They're a little more relaxed about it. And because of that, we have to have a lot of discrepancies with what training we're taking and what backgrounds there are. So as a part of this research, I tried to go through every course on the EMI catalog, all the NDPTC classes, as well as the independent study IS classes, and I counted about 14 trainings in weather. Obviously, with like the floodplain mapping and some of that stuff, I cut that stuff out because that's a little more about applying mapping. And I was kind of more interested in just looking at what scientific weather working trainings we had. But overall, 14 trainings. As a part of this research, I also will be highlighting OK First program that's been around for a very long time in the state of Oklahoma. And then I also wanted to touch on some of the COMET meta trainings that they have geared towards emergency management. Not a lot of emergency managers know those trainings exist through COMET, but some of them might be valuable to include in some kind of training framework or even like a certification process. Out of those 14 trainings, though, some are very good, and I will actually echo what he said in the beginning of the training about all of the NDPTC weather classes. Those are very, very good, very modern. They really reflect a lot of the weather communications and even some of the weather misconceptions we see a lot in decision making. But besides that, we're still missing a lot of key misconceptions that emergency managers need to kind of learn more about to be able to have that confidence and make the right decisions. So these are all the courses actually listed out. So you'll see that I highlighted a few of those, and I also threw in space weather. I haven't taken that new space weather class. It's a brand new class, but because it has so much to do with communication and it's space weather, I included it. You could potentially throw it out if you wanted to. You'll see the IS classes, once again, are online. The E classes and the G classes are classroom state sponsor classes. And then, of course, the AWR are those classes we were talking about earlier. So what are some notable issues of why we need to have better weather-related training, or why we might want to look at doing like a weather-related certification program? After reading a lot of papers, 15 to 20, and doing kind of a literature review on what we've done research-wise on emergency management, understanding weather forecasts, I've learned a lot about intuition and guesswork. So there are a lot of emergency managers who have said time and time again that their decision-making process about evacuation or opening EOC or doing anything like that overly relies on their gut feeling. You know, they feel like they should do it. They're worried. While intuition might be helpful, I really would love to see a little more use of data and confidence in receiving a forecast briefing from NWS and saying, that's the reason, right? It's not, oh, I think we're going to have a tornado hit today. It's, I'm confident that we need to open up because the forecast is calling for tornadoes. These are the conditions, and this is where I got my briefing from, and this is who I trust. On top of that, we have a lot of emergency managers who also overly rely on past history and experiences. So maybe they were in a marginal risk of severe weather last year and they had a bad storm, and they decide to make the same exact decisions because of what happened last year. That can be helpful with some stuff, but we do know, like with hurricanes and other storm systems, that every storm is unique and different. The impacts are different. And then two, just how things are modeling and things like that. You can't compare one storm or one setup to another. Also, a big concern with past history and experiences is the fact that our weather and climate situation is doing unmeasurable and unseen things. So I really hope that our field can kind of get away from trying to learn from past history, because we're about to be in an era of climate change and just severe weather that we have never seen before. We also had some emergency managers shown in research who struggled to assess risk. And then we had a majority also say that they felt like it was their duty as an emergency manager to lead the weather interpretation process rather than just kind of listen to what the meteorologist is saying and then amplify them. A really good example would be a study I read on sirens, where an emergency manager said, well, you know, even if NWS doesn't put out a warning, or maybe they said there's not a tornado in that storm, I still feel in my gut feeling that there is one, so I'm still going to say siren. So even if they say no, I go with my gut feeling every time. That's an issue. I personally feel like that if we can bridge relationships and bridge training, then maybe we can get away from that estimation on ourselves and start to actually use data. Outside of just guesswork in our field, we're also looking at a lack of interpretation abilities. There are a lot of really great studies on POPs, or percent of precipitation, and emergency managers have been known to really struggle with understanding, 50% chance of rain, 50% chance of tornadoes. And then at EMI a couple of weeks ago, I actually talked to a Houston emergency manager, and he did not understand SPC's tornado percentage. And they actually had a tornado, I think, a couple of months ago, and he said, well, I didn't really think it was a threat, even though it was a 10%. And we all know with SPC, 10% is fairly high because of how they're doing the percentiles, and it's within that 25-mile range. So we do have an issue with interpreting just some of the numbers and some of the probabilistic information. I think we all know and we all vent that EMs struggle heavily to understand spaghetti models. And even if NWS and any meteorologist on TV says, don't look at them, EMs have been known to still look at them. And when I was working in Texas, the state of Texas Emergency Management Department would actually send those out from some random site to all the emergency managers as like awareness. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's not a good thing. But yeah, so having a better understanding of what a spaghetti model is, how do you interpret it? Should I be looking at it? Why is it a problem? Research also has shown cone confusion, projection line confusion, and then, believe it or not, confusion between just watches and warnings. Some EMs were actually cited to go shopping during a watch, and they were like, well, it was just a watch. Like, I didn't really think anything was going to happen. So there's just a lack of understanding of why watches are out, what that means, and some of the decisions with that. Outside of that, taking a look at the lack of knowledge of tools. And I will say, usually when I talk to a lot of emergency managers around the country, not a lot know about how much cool weather data there is for free out there to use. If you're not receiving training, if you're not getting any guidance from anybody, you're not going to know what to use, how to use it, where to find it. Research has shown that if I don't know where to find it, I'm not going to use it. So kind of that simple finding. And then two, there's actually a lack of use in our field of long-term outlooks for drought and wildfire. I think we've gotten good at doing decisions based on like SPC or convective outlooks, severe weather, obviously some of the tropical stuff too, and then flood, of course. But believe it or not, there's not a lot of decision-making being made with long-term outlooks, especially in terms of maybe working on mitigation in wildfire areas, especially if the summer's projected to be rough. So that might be another area we can explore. And then lastly, there's that lack of trust, which I think over the past 10 years, we've really done a lot better with, but it is still being cited in modern day research. So having a lack of understanding of what certainty means and what that forecast means. How was it put together? What's the error mean? A lack of understanding that just because you didn't get the tornado in your backyard, that doesn't mean the forecast is wrong. It just means that it ended up not in your backyard, right? It's down the road, or just not grasping exactly what that forecast means to them. Also, there were some studies that cited just not really having confidence in receiving briefing information and making decisions. So one emergency manager decided to keep their EOC open, even though NWS said, you're all clear. The cold front moved through. It's all stable air mass. You're not going to have anything. That gut was telling them, well, I'm scared. Like, I don't want to close this and then have something happen. So I'm going to stay 4 more hours. And it doesn't seem like it would be a problem, but we are spending extra overtime doing that. You're bringing partners in and making them sit doing nothing, which also might lessen their enthusiasm to come to your EOC next time, and things like that. And then lastly, we do have that false alarm ratio. So once again, if I trust your forecast and I pre-deploy resources and I do all this stuff and then nothing happens, then I'm going to be angry and not do it next time. And I'm not going to trust you because you're paid to be wrong, right? So it's just not understanding, I feel like, how a forecast is put together.
Ashley, do you think, is there any hazard that else like that? Like, you know, if I went to most EMs and said, hey, here, what's the cyber issue? Like, I would think almost all of them would send to IT, or if, you know, if there's a break and the bridge is ready to collapse, I don't think any EM would say the gut. Does that kind of make, is that anything you've heard of otherwise then in weather? It seems like everyone thinks they're a weather expert, but no one ever says that about you know, the cement concentrations, or, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't hear that a lot from any other hazards, especially how I've worked. And of course, I haven't read studies on that. So there might be research on that that says otherwise. But it was very interesting to me, especially the tornado siren study with the quote that says, even if they say no, I'm going to do it. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Like, I don't really understand how we're trying to play scientists, but I really wish that we could change that.
Thanks.
Stayed at a Holiday Inn Express.
Yeah. So kind of moving forward and taking a look at just training and weather related education. I already kind of talked a little bit about just EMI and NDPTC having courses. And like I said, the NDPTC classes are really good. They do have a lot of the uncertainty stuff in there. They have education on the NOAA setup. So what's the Storm Prediction Center? What's the WPC Weather Prediction Center? What are the local offices, River Forecast Center, all that stuff. And those are big issues that I think that we have in emergency management, in the sense that you don't ever learn that. And then if you don't take the training, then you're never going to use it, right? But outside of that, the only other options for any kind of training would be an individual actually pursuing classes in meteorology. So maybe they went to college for meteorology, came over, maybe they see the value of meteorology in their decision making, and they go to Penn State and do their meteorology certification or certificate, I believe. But basically, you have to pursue higher level education to find those classes. And then outside of that, of course, we do have NWS partner development. And I know a lot of emergency managers I talked to kind of cited some of those IWT activities where they're briefing on misconceptions or products or things like that. And then some offices actually do their own trainings and webinars and radar interpretation and all that cool stuff. Now, all of that is awesome, except we all have to come back to say that there is no required weather-related training. So if I get hired in a jurisdiction, I don't have to take any weather-related training, even though I have to brief other people on weather and potentially make life-critical, life-saving decisions with that. And then in terms of NWS trainings, while I have really welcomed their initiatives, which have been really great, a lot of them vary tremendously. So, you know, the initiatives that you see in the southern region are not happening in the eastern region nearly as much as maybe they should. I would say the same on a state level. Like some states have WFOs who all work together to do campaigns, like up in Pennsylvania. Other states don't. And then lastly, just the office to office level, you see a lot of change. Some meteorologists in certain offices are really passionate about some of this stuff with crisis communications or things like that. So they're intentionally taking the time to do IWTs and all of this cool stuff. But other offices just don't have that. And there's not a consistency across the country. And it really leads to kind of a challenge for EMs to receive that information, because I think some states do a better job of it than others. So kind of just touching on OK First, I know we have some Oklahoma people on the call. So any questions should definitely go to them. But OK First has been a really cool program, and it actually originally started as a way to get weather data to Oklahoma emergency managers. So they crafted that dashboard that you see on the screen with radar. Obviously, the Mesonet was a huge thing of making sure you had current observations, satellite, all of that. And they actually developed a course that is 1 week long for you to get a certification and have access to that tool. So if you don't take the class, you don't get to have that tool. To keep the tool, you actually have to do a 1-day refresher every 18 months. And they actually cited in the study that a lot of emergency managers were very receptive to come to their 1-day refresher. Usually during that day, they might cover a new topic, a new tool, dual pol or whatever is new in weather data at that time. There have been a lot of successes. So the study about this that I'm highlighting actually talked to EMs after they went through it, and they did say they felt more confident trusting local NWS offices for information and making decisions. The training also included radar interpretation, not meteorology radar interpretation. We're not trying to get emergency managers to be meteorologists because we already have meteorologists helping us. We're just training them to be able to look at a radar in an EOC and understand the basics of what's going on. And after they received that training, they were better to interpret the radar. They understood a little better of what a couplet meant. They also understood that just because red and green touches on velocity, that doesn't mean that it's a tornado every time. And it actually saved some good decisions and bad decisions, especially in Oklahoma with sirens. The trained EMs actually showed a more proactive approach to weather after training. So after they went through OK First, they learned these tools, they learned all the basics, and they had this information. They were seen to do more pre-deployment of resources. So putting out barricades before the flood, doing pre-deployment things, being more or less reactive, more leaning forward. And like I mentioned, they're just more confident. And I really think that in a stressful situation where people's lives are at stake, like having confidence that you're doing what's good for the people, but also what's good for your job really helps you make better decisions and really takes the pressure off for you to do what you're supposed to do. This slide just have a bunch of different citations from different studies. So kind of just to touch on a couple. More experienced EMs who had training were able to identify weather threats better than a new emergency manager, which kind of makes sense because they're new. They don't have a lot of experience or anything outside of that. That actually came from the OK First study, and the experienced trained EM was able to sound the sirens correctly with the velocity, while the other one who didn't receive the training did not. So that's a huge deal. It really shows that weather-related training can help us make better decisions that are more scientifically accurate. Obviously, we have a lot of work on the NWS side and in studies that shows that they should initiate a program developed to inform and educate the public as well as emergency managers on weather forecasts and events and stuff like that. And then lastly, there was actually a paper at the very bottom that said that EM training needed to be improved significantly since 84% of participants have received instructions on how to use these products at some point. So it just echoes that weather-related training is successful and highly needed since we're just doing it so much. Just kind of wrap up key findings. So as I mentioned, we are missing a lot of key issues with our training, and these would actually be some of the key issues. The areas in red are actually in those NDPTC classes. So I believe all of them except hurricane cover how a forecast is made. They also cover a little bit of 10,000 foot NWP, numerical weather prediction, how models are coming together, how multiple models are used, how runs are made, where the error comes from. I think that really can help emergency managers grasp what a forecast means and also be a little more forgiving when something doesn't happen right. Also, as you can see in red, the challenge of flood and snow forecasting, that is actually included in the flood awareness class as well as the snow forecasting class. And then lastly, all of those weather classes by NDPTC cover the office setup, like I mentioned. So what's the weather service? What's the storm prediction center? Which is great. However, the other items are items that have been kind of tripping points for EMs in different studies, as well as just feedback. And I would like to take a look at research to see if maybe we can have that a little more set in stone. But it would be really nice to make sure that our weather-related training covers some of these things. Outside of OK First, we don't have a lot of weather-related training that's doing radar interpretation basics. So what are the basics? What are the limitations? Like how far you are from the radar, You know, the beams cutting up over the storm so you can't see, like those very simple basics that would help EMs better understand the data that they're looking at. We also have the issue of straight line winds versus tornado winds. A lot of people just like to ramp up for tornado over squall line. So making sure that we're emphasizing that the danger of winds is danger, right? Taking a look at basic storm mode science, I will say Science of Disaster does an okay job of that, as well as a couple of the other FEMA classes. But I think we could probably better educate EMs on what's a squall, what are the threats associated with a squall, what's a setup with a cold front, and what kind of hazards are you associating with that. It would help them better understand what to expect, rather than maybe thinking tornadoes every time when you might just have a straight line wind threat. Another notable thing is the danger of heat and cold. So not just focusing on the scary storms, but also on heat waves, extreme cold, and then the difference between heat index and wet bulb global temperature. Storm myths, so talking about lightning and bolts from the blue, especially for special events, would be very helpful. Touching on pops and probability. And then just going over just some generalized weather triggers and some other things. I will say I have had kind of issues like in certain offices with us wanting to set specific weather triggers with categories of storms or watches or things like that. And I really wish that we could educate more on looking at the impacts, because the category doesn't mean anything, as we all know, and then not every tornado watch necessarily means the same for you. So once again, I think training on that would help us make better decisions. So my next steps, so obviously I've got 2 months to finish this paper. So I'm going to finish the draft and submit it to EMI. And then after that, I really want to take a look at how we could set up trainings. So obviously the first step would be to utilize the current trainings we have. NDPTC has an excellent set of classes that we could easily start promoting and getting the state training officers to start setting up more consistently, or even trying to make like a state track and an association certification or something. But we could easily use what we have because we have some good stuff. The next step would be to push for consistent NWS programs. And I know that anytime I get an opportunity to go to a weather conference and sit with anybody from NWS headquarters, I try to argue for that, or at least just mention, because it's been so different going from Southern region to Eastern region. And I really just hope we can get consistent IDSS and just processes. The next step would be to build courses that cover the holes. So it would be really cool if we had an OK First program outside of Oklahoma. You know, can states pick up that program? Could EMI maybe develop something? Or I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. And then also taking a look at new courses that we could develop at EMI. How can we revamp like Science of Disaster and some of the classes that kind of hit a little bit of the weather stuff, but they're missing all of those bad decisions that we're making that we should clarify. And then lastly, it would be absolutely fantastic if we could have a weather track, either a part of the CEM or an additional certification through IAEM, maybe taking a look at the American Meteorological Society or even the National Weather Association and seeing if we can have an emergency management certification. I know AMS and NWA have that for media meteorologists. It would be really cool if we could do that, and then also work with the state and partner up and do that, just so we can try to push a little more weather education in what we're doing. A last next step would obviously be expanding to climate science. As we mentioned before, climate and weather got split off with the caucus because they're a little bit different from each other. They're the same but different. And I think the climate probably needs to have its own focus. So it would be really cool too if we could actually take a look at climate, see what kind of content we should put with climate, and then push that out as something else, maybe with hazard mitigation like it is in the caucus. And with that, that's all I have. And thank you so much for letting me rant and rave and talk a lot about weather education.
Awesome. Any questions or comments from the group?
I would love it.